thought I'd see another Democratic presidential inauguration. After all, who am I? Just another old widow of a long-dead president. Well, I'm so thrilled Mr. Kennedy has invited me. No one remembers presidents' wives, I know that. Even during a presidency, most of us are little more than a White House decoration or a token of a president's good taste. But I ask you, how many sitting presidents fell in love and got married while they were president? That made me different. But that's not the only thing that made me different. I remember early in our relationship asking Woodrow if he ever thought there'd be a woman president. Well, that's about as likely as a Negro president. Not in 100 years. I don't know if a woman will ever be elected president, but when Woodrow suffered a stroke, well, someone else had to take charge. And for a few months at least, that someone was me. Oh, I see you're skeptical. I understand. I look in the mirror and find it hard to believe that the wrinkled old hobgoblin who stares back at me once held history in her hands. Well, thank you for coming to help me get ready for the inauguration. I've been thinking of wearing this, but after last night's snow, I'm afraid I'll freeze to death. You think Mrs. Kennedy is worried about what she'll be wearing? Well, she is so young, so pretty. Did she ever imagine she'd be married to the President of the United States? Well, I certainly didn't. After all, when he was first elected, Woodrow was happily married to Ellen, his wife of many years. No one imagined she'd die while he was in office. But that was long ago. After Woodrow's death, I published my memoir. I had to. Lies have been told about me. Some rumored that I caused Woodrow's illness, or even worse, that I had poisoned his first wife. Ridiculous nonsense, all of it. I had to defend my reputation. So I set down the story of our lives together. Although there were a few things I had to leave out. Can I trust you with these secrets? Between you and me, in my memoir, it was important for me to downplay my role and how much I did when Woodrow was stricken. See, it was through a series of unlikely coincidences that I met the president. My first husband, Norman Galt, had died a few years earlier. While I liked Norman, I hadn't really been interested in marrying him. But my circumstances gave me few options, and my family approved. Well, he was the owner of Galt's Jewelry. They catered to the Washington elite for over a century. Norman and I were happy enough, although I wouldn't say I loved him. When he died, everyone expected me to sell the jewelry business. But I enjoyed running Galt's Jewelry, and it flourished all the years I owned it. Then another death changed the course of my life. As he lay dying, my dear friend James Gordon asked me to take care of his daughter Altrude. Well, here I was in my late 30s, suddenly having to care for a headstrong 17-year-old who I didn't know well at all. What better way to get to know each other than to travel together? We set sail for Europe on the Lusitania. Yes, that ship. Now, I hadn't anticipated the effect Altrude would have on the men on board the ship. Oh, she had so many suitors clamoring to dance with her, she nearly tipped that boat over. But the big surprise was that I had one too, a British Army officer, no less. Oh, I hadn't danced in 20 years. Oh, is there anything more romantic than dancing? Well, for 2 months, Altrude and I traveled through Europe, finally ending in Paris, where we spent almost all our time in the fashion houses. We each came home with a new wardrobe. Oh, what I'd give to turn the clock back. But I digress. I mentioned Altrude because it was through her that I first went to the White House. Although I'd lived in Washington for 15 years, I never paid any attention to politics since back then women didn't have the right to vote. In fact, in the election of 1912, I didn't even know who the candidates were. We had heard in Paris that a Mr. Woodrow Wilson had won. But the name didn't mean anything to me. Upon our return, my mission was to find a suitable husband for my protege, Altrude. And needless to say, he had to come from a good family, be a gentleman, and have a good position. Immediately, this eliminated most of her admirers. Then there was Dr. Grayson. I asked him about his practice. Oh, it's very small, Mrs. Galt. I have just one patient. Just the one? Perhaps he wasn't such a good prospect after all. Yes, ma'am, the president. Oh my. The president's personal physician. Here was a good catch for Altrude. Well, access to her was through me. Well, I got to know Dr. Grayson well. I enjoyed his stories about the White House and the president, but I was sad to hear of Mrs. Wilson's illness, and then that she had died so suddenly. Oh, how could poor Mr. Wilson cope with this tragedy, just as war was breaking out all over Europe? And Dr. Grayson introduced me to Woodrow's cousin, Helen, who'd taken over the role of hostess since the First Lady had passed. Now, I wasn't interested in the White House social circle, but Helen and I would often go walking together. One day, she suggested we stop at the White House for tea. Oh, I protested, but she assured me the president was out. So imagine my surprise when, as we stepped off the elevator, we ran right into him, head on. Oh, I was so embarrassed. I wasn't dressed properly. I had mud on my clothes. Mrs. Galt, oh, no need to apologize. I'm sure a muddy dress has never looked so pretty in the White House. Dr. Grayson has told me so much about you. I'm delighted you're here, with or without a little mud. Well, after that, of course I stayed for tea. Oh, how we talked. So many stories about our families in Virginia. We laughed at how we'd both been frightened of our fathers. Mine a judge, his a Presbyterian minister. Woodrow was amused to learn that I was descended from Pocahontas. Later, he would tease me and call me his Indian princess. When finding that we both loved traveling through France, he gave me a book. Hamilton's Round My House. A Scottish painter searches for the perfect French village. It was Woodrow's first gift to me. And speaking of gifts, it was about this time that Altrude began receiving flowers from Dr. Grayson every day. I knew it was time for us to have the talk. See, I've noticed that we women see flowers as an innocent token of friendship, but for men, flowers are the keys to the kingdom, if you understand what I mean. Altrude was shocked that I'd suggest Dr. Grayson's intentions were anything less than honorable. She swore he wasn't like other men. Well, I lectured her that if she wanted to win her man, essential she withhold her affections from him. But Edie, don't the flowers prove that I've already won his heart? When his ring is on your finger, then we'll know you've caught him. A few days later, Altrude and I were invited to the White House for dinner. The president greeted me warmly with flowers. Mr. President, thank you. Not what I expected. Oh, it'd been a long time since I caught the eye of an attractive man. And make no mistake, the president was attractive. I became a frequent dinner guest. Now, one day that sticks in my memory is May 4th. We'd finished dinner at the White House and all the guests had left. Now, for a lawyer and politician so skilled with words, Woodrow was fumbling over what he wanted to say. After a long preamble, he professed he was in love with me. Of course, I saw this coming. What I hadn't expected was for him to take my hand and then kiss me with such ardor, I almost fell out of my chair. Not what I expected from the president, especially a devout Presbyterian. Then he asked me to marry him. Well, this was all going too fast. We'd only known each other a few weeks. I told him if he wanted an immediate answer, it would have to be no. I could see he was upset. As for me, well, to have someone, not just anyone, but the President of the United States fall in love with me, I was ready to dance around my house. 3 days later, I was back at the White House and the president received a telegram from Winston Churchill. Oh, dear God, they've sunk the Lusitania. That had to be a mistake. The Lusitania isn't a battleship, it's a liner. Well, I recall my own time on that boat. All I could think about were those poor women and children drowning as the ship was sinking. I mumbled something about feeling so insignificant compared to all the huge crises he had to cope with. No, Edith, it's this crisis that shows me how much I need you. I need you beside me as my wife. Oh, I wanted to say yes so badly, but it would cause such a scandal coming so soon after Ellen's death. I just asked him to be patient. Oh, that Lusitania crisis continued for several weeks. Berlin had accused the ship of being armed and carrying military supplies for the Allies. Woodrow worked on a reply. When he showed it to me, I realized it was weak. In an earlier letter to Berlin, I had felt his anger. But this one, well, might as well have been written by a secretary. Written by a secretary? It's that bad. I asked my cabinet to read it and no one told me it was weak. See, I need your advice and I want to hear it. People thought of Woodrow as cold and aloof. Oh, I can assure you, he was anything but cold. Oh my, no, he was not. But he could be moody. One day he had a dark cloud over his head. I asked him if it was the war in Europe. The war in Europe? No, it's you, Edith. Can't you see how you're tormenting me? I spend my days wondering if you'll ever give me an answer. Now, he told me he canceled his cabinet meetings because he couldn't stop thinking about me. Oh, I felt just terrible, distracting him from his work. I told him I loved him and that I would marry him, but I insisted our engagement could not be announced until at least a year after Ellen's death. Spending time together wasn't easy, but he had a suggestion. Look at this desk. There's space for the two of us. You can sit here and help me. So I began sign a document and give it to me to blot. We were like lovebirds, you know, how the male bird offers the female some sort of delicacy, a fat, juicy worm or a nut. Woodrow would offer me tidbits of information about people in government and what he was working on. I love that. Now, I admit, my eyes glazed over if he tried to explain the economy to me. You wouldn't think working on documents would be romantic. Sometimes he'd take hold of my hand and kiss me. Oh, more than once. I had to tell him to control himself and put away his naughty thoughts. I shouldn't be telling you this. There were just so many issues at home and abroad that confronted him. I remember when he heard the news about a lynching in South Carolina. Edith, how can we speak out against tyranny overseas and then tolerate such behavior here? I urged him to condemn lynching publicly, which he did. Now, I'd always thought that Woodrow had been supportive of Negro rights, but apparently some of them didn't think he was supportive enough. There were problems in the post office. The Postmaster General had pushed for segregation of the races. Woodrow saw this as reasonable. Well, he argued that when you have two groups of people at odds with each other, you can either force them to live together peacefully or separate them. Forcing them together wasn't working. Separation seemed the right answer, but it made sense, and I agreed. Some of their leaders complained about the situation. One of them even came into the White House and argued with the president. Woodrow was livid. He came in here and told me I'd betrayed him and his people. Now, who did he think he was, barging in and trying to push me around? I could see Woodrow was upset. I told him he shouldn't let his anger get in the way of his judgment. Judgment be damned. The man was rude and offensive. Now, I have had all manner of people in here, and I'm not going to allow some uppity Negro to push me around. Woodrow was getting mighty hot under the collar. I thought I'd better change the topic to something less controversial. Upcoming nuptials. But weddings, too, can cause a lot of tension. You see, I wanted our wedding to be small and private, limited to just family. Woodrow wanted to invite others, such as his advisor, Colonel House. But if we included the colonel, then he'd have to include his cabinet, and if the cabinet, then all the Democrats, and if the Democrats, then the Republicans. I put my foot down. It would be just family, and that was that. We had a honeymoon. Hot Springs, Virginia. For a few days, there were no documents for Woodrow to sign, no cabinet secretaries worried about this or that. It was bliss. But the European conflict refused to honor the Do Not Disturb sign on a honeymoon door. Mr. Tumulty, Woodrow's secretary, called to say that another ship had been sunk by the Germans, and could Woodrow come back and deal with the situation? Why Joe Tumulty couldn't have waited a few more days, I do not know. It did irritate me, his interrupting the president's honeymoon for something that wasn't a crisis. Now, returning to Washington, I knew I was being inspected by the crowds that came out to greet us. Judging by their applause, I wasn't a liability. In fact, during the election, I'm sure I brought in votes for Woodrow, particularly in the West where a woman could vote. Oh yes, back then in most states, women didn't have the vote. Oh, you probably think I was a suffragette, right? Hell no. Far from it, I hated those women. We all did. Woodrow, my sisters, my friends, there was all this talk about women's rights and even some notion that we were equal. Well, when I grew up, and for most of my life, this was a ridiculous idea. It's self-evident we aren't equal. Most of us were happy with the situation. And we aren't as strong as men. Not always brutish, but certainly less aggressive, and we are not so arrogant. We are more sensitive and notice things men are blind to. But can we govern? I'll let you be the judge. Now, Woodrow's success at keeping America out of the war in Europe was the major theme of his re-election campaign. By staying neutral, he knew he had the chance to act as peacemaker. Germany misled him. Publicly, they were for peace negotiations, but at the same time began a major submarine offensive in the Atlantic. Then we learned that they were encouraging Mexico to attack us, and, if you can believe it, to take back Texas. Woodrow struggled with the decision to go to war. But it seemed to me Germany had crossed the line. I told him he really had no choice. So Woodrow asked Congress for a declaration of war. Given his forebodings, I was fearful of what might happen. In a strange way, though, the war seemed to bring the country together. People put aside their differences. I wanted to do my part, so I volunteered for a Red Cross unit and fed soldiers passing through Washington. We gave them coffee and sandwiches and handed out cigarettes. Oh, there were so many of them. They were just boys, children. Many of them never returned. All across the nation, men were signing up with the army. I suggested to Woodrow that perhaps we could free up some of the gardeners for service if, well, instead of mowing the lawns, we got a herd of sheep. Sheep? Oh, Edith, that's a silly idea. Sheep will be the laughing stock of the press. A few weeks later, the sheep arrived. 8 of them. Oh, the press did make fun of us, but the public loved the sheep, especially when they gave birth to a dozen lambs. That first year, our sheep gave us 98 pounds of wool. My idea was to have the wool auctioned. We raised $100,000 for the Red Cross. I love those sheep. Now, in the midterm elections, just before the war ended, Woodrow knew it would help his peace negotiations if both chambers of Congress were supportive. So he wrote a letter to the nation asking them to give him a Democratic House and Senate. Oh, I could see this would enrage the Republicans. I told him not to send it, but he didn't listen. We lost both houses. Woodrow now had to work with enemies. One of them was Henry Cabot Lodge. He hated Woodrow, and now he'd become leader of the Senate. Henry Cabot Lodge was a snob. If ever there was aristocracy in America, his family was part of it. He looked down on Woodrow because Woodrow was a Southerner. Lodge opposed Woodrow on everything, particularly his decision to take me with him to the peace talks at Versailles. Of course, Woodrow would never go to Europe without me. Lodge accused him of making it a tourist trip. We arrived in France in mid-December, but the conference had been delayed. So we accepted the King of England's invitation to visit London. Oh, meeting King George and Queen Mary made me nervous. How was I to greet them? Do I curtsy? No, Edith. Curtsying is for servants. We're their equals. We'll be respectful and shake their hands like we would with leaders back home. Well, the king and queen seemed just fine with our manners. They gave us an extraordinary state dinner at Buckingham Palace. At the appropriate hour, 2 elderly gentlemen arrived at our rooms to escort us to the royal family. They stood facing us and together took a step backward and bowed. Of course, I thought they would then turn around and we'd follow them wherever we were meant to go. But no, they walked backwards the entire way. Each step followed by a bow. When we reached the stairs, did they turn around? No, they reversed all the way up, bowing with every step. I thought these elderly gentlemen would fall and break their necks. But they successfully guided us to our host. I wore a princess velvet evening gown with a train. The queen was dazzling in a white gown with the Order of the Garter across her bodice. Now, I know something about jewels, but I've never seen such diamonds. To the music of Elgar. The King of England himself escorted me into the dining room. Oh, could anything be more radiant than this bejeweled procession? Well, possibly the dining room itself. Everything there was gold. Gold plates, gold cutlery, gold chandeliers, gold dishes. Even the walls had enough gold to put Fort Knox to shame. For a moment, I must admit to becoming a monarchist. But the feeling was nearly dashed when the orchestra began to play Dixie. I guess they were trying to make us feel welcome. Well, we returned to Paris, and eventually the peace talks began. Oh, the bureaucracy, the committees, the meetings, too much. Now, Woodrow had 2 overriding issues he wanted to fight for: the right of the peoples to self-determination and the League of Nations. And to have each nation subscribe to an international organization that would maintain peace seemed our only hope of preventing future wars. Much of the world agreed. It never occurred to him that the Senate might not ratify the League. What cemented his determination was when we visited a cemetery in France. Oh, it was a bleak day. What had once been a rolling field was now row upon row of white crosses as far as the eye could see. Woodrow knelt beside one of the crosses and read the inscription. Then he ran his hand over the cross and wept. I was their commander-in-chief. I sent these boys here. They died fighting for freedom, and I will not allow their deaths to have been in vain. That's why he wouldn't compromise on the League of Nations. It was something sacred. He would honor their sacrifice. Now, walking through that cemetery, it didn't seem real. Each cross representing a life. But the impact of war became horribly real when I visited the hospitals for the wounded. Well, my routine was to shake the soldiers' hands and thank them. It was awkward and inadequate, but they were appreciative. One ward was for head wounds. How do you not recoil when you see a disfigured face? Here was a room full of disfigured faces. One young man had just a hole where his nose and mouth should have been. perhaps. Now, what could his future possibly be? Wouldn't it have been better if he'd have died on the battlefield? I told Woodrow that any politicians contemplating war should visit a hospital like that one outside Paris. Well, we returned from Paris, hopeful about the future. We thought we'd left behind the conniving, duplicitous politicians of Europe for honest statesmen in America. How wrong we were. Woodrow invited Henry Cabot Lodge and the Foreign Relations Committee to dinner to discuss the League of Nations. He laid out for them its principles and how he saw it contributing to peace. Now, wasn't peace what everyone wanted? We took Lodge's comments as support for the League. But the very next day, he came out against it. Lodge was a lawyer, and he used his lawyerly skills to turn each virtue of the League into a vice. The battle became personal. If Lodge disliked Woodrow, he was downright contemptuous of me. I sat next to Mrs. Wilson at a state dinner once. She didn't understand what we were talking about. When you hear Mrs. Wilson, you know why a woman should never be allowed to vote. Like my pet parrot, she spends most of her time preening her feathers. Oh, how I hated the man. Woodrow became obsessed in his fight with Lodge over the League. Well, he was determined to bring the League to fruition and wanted to waste no time. So we embarked on a whistle-stop tour across the country, bringing the idea of the League of Nations to the people. Some days Woodrow gave 3 speeches a day. There was no let-up. He couldn't sleep, and I was worried about his constant headaches. Dr. Grayson warned him about his high blood pressure. Near the end of the tour, he was collapsing. Against his will, Grayson and I canceled the last few stops and rushed him back to Washington. Now, we'd only been back just a couple of days when early one morning I heard a crash from Woodrow's room, and I rushed in. There he was, lying on the floor, unconscious. Oh, I thought he was dying. I ran for Dr. Grayson and watched as he and other doctors tended to Woodrow. After several hours, I learned he had a stroke. His left side was paralyzed, and Dr. Grayson tried to reassure me he might recover, but it wasn't certain. In the meantime, he thought he needed to make an announcement about Woodrow's condition. No! Oh, I couldn't let him do that. Absolutely not. If Congress learned he had a stroke, they'd force him to resign. I wasn't going to allow him to be removed from the presidency. Well, if he recovered from the stroke, being removed from the presidency would kill him. Now, surely the country wouldn't come to a grinding halt if the president were absent for a few days. Little did I know it'd be months. Well, I allowed Grayson to announce that the president was suffering from nervous exhaustion. For the moment, someone else had to take charge. Couldn't be so difficult. Now, my determination to keep things running was shared by Woodrow's personal secretary, Joseph Tumulty. I'm embarrassed to say, but I'd once pressed Woodrow to fire Tumulty. I saw him as a liability. See, Tumulty was Irish Catholic. That could have cost Woodrow some votes. Yes, I see you smiling. Today we celebrate the inauguration of Mr. Kennedy, our first Irish Catholic president. Well, times do change. Well, after me, no one loved Woodrow as much as Joe. He had talents. Some of them worried me. He could gift. Let me explain. First though, I had been talking so much, I'm parched. Now growing up in the judge's house, so I'd have a drink. It wasn't until my first dinner in France, the host thrust a glass into my hand and declared a toast. Salty. Oh, it all happened so quickly. I found myself with a mouth full of cool liquid, bursting with tiny bubbles. After the initial shock, I discovered champagne was all right. It was followed by a glass of red wine. That was less to my liking. But then with dessert, pure joy. This, I learned, was Sauterne, and I've savored many a glass since. Where was I? I get distracted again. Oh, yes, the first crisis I faced was how to handle the Volstead bill, or as it's better known, prohibition. It would have banned this sweet elixir. Congress sent the bill for the president to sign. Now you probably think a Presbyterian president wouldn't drink. You would be wrong. Whenever he visited the troops, he made a point of enjoying a beer with them, and he indulged in an occasional scotch or bourbon with a friend. Now, Woodrow and I, we both could see the problems caused by drink, but was prohibition the answer? Well, he argued that the rich would still have their drinks regardless, but the working man who loved his glass of beer after a hard day, he'd be deprived. He could go along with banning spirits, but not beer or wine. What was I to do? Well, I turned to Tumulty, who was against prohibition. After all, he was Irish. Now, he put together a letter as if it come from Woodrow, indicating why he was vetoing the Volstead bill. Oh, I hope you'll agree, this was a small and worthy deception. And what was Congress's response to my first executive action? They overrode my veto. We all know the consequences. A decade of crime and violence because there were those who would not go without. Oh, for much of the population, those were unhappy years, unhappy indeed. We all thought the war's end would bring joy and prosperity. It was the opposite. The country seemed to be falling apart. The troops returned and unemployment shot up. There were strikes everywhere. To sort out this mess, Woodrow had convened a conference, bringing together representatives from all sides. Now, the Secretary of the Interior had sent the draft of a letter he'd hoped Woodrow would send to the conference. Tumulty and I used every word of it. I smiled when the New York Times declared that the president, in spite of his poor health, was so closely following the president and the Congress and the Congress. Well, there were international crises too. When I didn't know how to deal with them, I sent the Secretary of State a message. The president says it is impossible to deal with such matters until he is stronger and can study them. Of course, he hadn't said anything, but I found a wonderful way to procrastinate. Procrastination really does solve many problems. One crisis I could not postpone was how to deal with the Bolsheviks. These revolutionists came into the country disguised as Russian immigrants. There was a spate of bomb attacks. The Attorney General had been targeted. A bomb had destroyed part of his home. Now, he was a Quaker and should have been a peace-loving man. But after that bomb, he became decidedly non-Quaker. He came to me wanting Woodrow's approval to go after the Bolsheviks. Well, of course, I didn't want him at Woodrow's bedside. I said I'd relay his message. Now, I knew Woodrow never wanted immigrants to be blamed for the problems the country was facing. These weren't immigrants to be welcomed. They were spies and agents coming in with malice against us. My decision was easy. I knew that the security of the nation was the first duty of any president. I knew this. So I told the Attorney General that the president had approved his plans to round up the Bolsheviks and have them deported. In charge of the operation was a young and enthusiastic subordinate, a Mr. J. Edgar Hoover. Those raids were when he first got his start. Now, I like Mr. Hoover, but so many people seem scared of him. He always compliments me on my dresses and inquires where I purchased them. Sweet man. Now, the State of the Union address was another crisis. It was due in early December, but Woodrow clearly wasn't up to creating a State of the Union address and giving it to Congress. Then I had an idea. Until Woodrow, see, presidents had sent their State of the Union address to Congress as a letter. Woodrow had insisted on giving his in person as a speech. Well, why don't we just go back to sending it as a letter? So Tumulty and I composed a State of the Union address that was sent to Congress. No one was any the wiser. Now, Woodrow's absence from public life did raise questions, though. Henry Cabot Lodge wanted the president's health assessed by someone other than Dr. Grayson. So he found a cause that supposedly required a meeting with the president. An American businessman had been kidnapped by Mexican forces. 2 senators were dispatched to the White House to discuss the situation with the president. Grayson was worried, but I came up with a plan. See, if his left side was covered and he was propped up in bed with his right arm exposed and the lighting was low, perhaps they wouldn't notice his left side was paralyzed. I was worried when I learned that the Republican senator picked by Lodge was Albert Fall. Oh, a rattlesnake from New Mexico. Was there ever a more corrupt senator? Later, he was sent to prison for taking bribes. Well, I spent the morning telling Woodrow all the details and all the facts about the Mexican situation. Kept muddling up the details and forgetting what this was all about. But Grayson and I had an ace up our sleeve. Upon entering Woodrow's room, Mr. Fall greeted the president with false heartiness. "Mr. President, how are you? We've been praying for you." "Which way, Senator?" Woodrow had his wits about him. They discussed the Mexican situation, and with his right hand he gave them papers, all the while keeping his left side covered up. I was relieved he remembered everything I told him and projected an air of authority. Then Grayson played our trump card. He was called out of the room and returned a few minutes later. "Mr. President, I'm sorry for the interruption. I just thought you'd like to know that the Mexican crisis has been resolved. Mr. Jenkins has been released and is on his way home." But of course, we learned this information earlier in the day. Later, Fall reported favorably on Woodrow's health, and that he was fully in command of foreign policy. In fact, from that time onward, Woodrow's health did improve, albeit slowly. Our lives fell into a routine. In the mornings, I'd help him with his government work. He did need a lot of help. His memory was poor, and I had to explain many things to him. But his greatest joy was when Altrude, my protege, who'd married Dr. Grayson, came round with a beautiful 2-year-old son, Gordon. Oh, young Gordon Grayson and the president became the best of friends. The door would open, and the 2-year-old would rush in looking for Woodrow. They celebrated their frequent reunions over milk and cookies. Now, Woodrow did not attend the inauguration of his successor, Warren Harding, as he couldn't manage the stairs. Edith, the Senate threw me down the stairs once before. I don't want to fall down them this time on my own. So we slipped away and entered private life. Our remaining 3 years together were marked by his continued decline. He passed away one Sunday in February. In a final cruel act, the Senate named Lodge as their representative at the funeral. That was the final insult. Oh, I requested he not attend. As we were leaving the White House, Woodrow's enemies had succeeded in making him very unpopular. He was blamed for all the country's problems, even the influenza epidemic. I sometimes wonder if it wouldn't have been better for Woodrow to have died from an assassin's bullet. Well, near the end of the war, at that point, he was a hero and would have died a hero. I mean, look at how Lincoln is revered. I dare say Lincoln's reputation would also have taken a nosedive had he survived and had to cope with all the problems following his war. Now, I've spent the last 40 years working to restore Woodrow's standing. His vision for the League of Nations was inspired. It's a tragedy that vision was thwarted by narrow-minded politicians. He would have been thrilled with the establishment of the United Nations. This is what I wear today. Is it still stylish? Good. I hope it makes me look a bit younger. Oh, what a pair they are, the Kennedys. So romantic. They remind me of Woodrow and me. He's so handsome, and she has fashion sense like I do. Oh, I hope they fare better than we did. As for Jackie, I pray she never experiences heartache like I did that last year in the White House. It was very good of them to invite me to the inauguration. But I do have one regret. I secretly hope to be invited to the inaugural ball. Woodrow was never much of a dancer. I may be old, but I would have loved to have gone to one last ball and to have had one last dance.